This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 161 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we are talking about cycling across the world. Now, I didn't actually go out to make an episode about cycling across the world. It just so happened that a couple of really interesting people I spoke to have cycled across the world. But it's not what you think. So initially, if I think of the idea of cycling across the world, I think, wow, that sounds crazy. I would never even dream about it. That's too hard. Lots and lots of objections. But when you listen to my chats with these two guys who have cycled across the world, it kind of feels like all you need is a bicycle and quite a lot of time. So don't discount it. And if nothing else, then hearing their stories about their big cycling trips across the world is really eye-opening. They learnt a lot, and I guess in turn they can teach us a lot. So I will get to that in a second. But before then, I just want to tell you something really important. I have of late been paying more attention to my numbers. You might remember I have a maths degree, so I like numbers. And I realised that we are on track to, in the next few months, hit 250,000 downloads of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. And that seems like a really big number. And in fact, if it continued as we are, the kind of average number of downloads each week, we would get to 250,000 downloads sometime in January or early February next year. And I thought, well, why not set myself a bit of a challenge? I may not be about to cycle across the world, but it's just for lack of time, really. But maybe I can set myself a challenge to reach 250,000 downloads of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast by the end of 2019. So it's kind of early-ish November. We've got a bit under 2 months to go, and I reckon you can help me out. So if you would like to see me hit my goal and reach 250,000 downloads by the end of the year, maybe you can help out by either leaving a review on iTunes, telling a friend about the podcast, posting a link to your favourite episode on social media or somewhere else, or even if you know someone who you think would love listening to podcasts but hasn't quite figured out how to do that yet, catch up with them, pick up their phone, download a podcast app of choice, or use Apple Podcasts if they're on an iPhone, and actually download an episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast for them. I've done that with lots of people, and I love enabling people to learn about the world of podcasts, because although they are ever more popular, there are still heaps and heaps of people out there who have not yet ever listened to a podcast. And that's pretty sad, isn't it? Because there's so much to discover. They don't have to listen to just the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. There's so much else out there. So anyway, I hope you will join me on my goal of reaching 250,000 downloads by the end of the year. And thank you very much in advance if you do. So back to cycling across the world, which is quite a feat. But as I said, something that is really just a learning journey, kind of like all kinds of travel. And the first person to chat to me about this today is Alastair Humphreys. You may remember we've spoken with him before, and he's written a bunch of books, including some awesome children's books about cycling across the world, one of which is At the Bedside of My Son as I Speak. But anyway, here's what Alastair had to say about his journey across the world on a bike.
Well, I think when I end up talking about travel, the question that people usually ask me about is cycling around the world. And yes. I guess that's because it was the biggest adventure that I have ever done, and I'm almost certainly ever to do. It was also the first big adventure I ever did, which I guess makes it more special to me. And that also set me off towards all the other trips that I've done. So I think climbing on my bike after finishing university at my family house in the north of England and setting off to try to cycle around the world was probably the the biggest trip I've done, and certainly the story that people ask me about the most. My original plan, actually, when I set off from home, was to cycle to Australia. That was my plan. England to Australia as the first leg of Round the World. But the September 11th attacks happened just a couple of weeks into the trip. And suddenly my scenic route through Afghanistan didn't seem like such a fun idea anymore. So I ended up from Istanbul in Turkey turning right instead and heading to Cape Town. So I set off to try to cycle to Australia, but ended up in South Africa. So that's some pretty dodgy geography somewhere along the line.
Isn't it just? Yes, very poor map reading there. But it's important to be flexible when we travel. So I think that was probably a good choice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, at the time, I was all very stressed by all sorts of aspects of life and the world at that time. But it served me well for trying now to come up with ideas for adventure that serve mostly just to get me out the front door, and then to allow whatever will be after that. So to plan enough to give me the guts to begin, and then to trust the fates of the universe to see what actually happens.
Yeah, I think that's true, whether you are taking off to cycle around the world or whether you're just going off on a, shall we call it, a normal trip somewhere that you might be slightly nervous about. It's really just enough to get going. And once you've got going, things tend to work out, don't they?
Yeah, and cycling was an interesting thing, because if someone was going to go plan to, say, cycle 100 kilometres to their neighbouring town, you could probably pack for that in an hour. You'd get your bike and your tent and strap it all on and put your credit card and toothbrush in your pocket and go. Mm-hmm. And cycling around the world, you don't actually need any more gear than that. All you're doing is cycling to the next town, and then the next town, and then the next town for a very long time. But as I was riding, I realized, why did I spend so many months and months and months planning and planning and planning? And I realized that the reason planning was so important for that trip was that it gave me the guts to set off. I don't think I would have dared start with zero planning. So the planning really just served to build me a safety net to get me going. And then once I was off, as you say, everything usually turns out to be fine. And if it doesn't turn out fine, that at least makes for a good story later on.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Oh, yeah. The things that go wrong are definitely the best stories, I think, and certainly the ones that you tell more often than not. How long did it take you to cycle around the world in the end?
It took me 4 years to cycle around the world. So I cycled to South Africa from England. Then I crossed the Atlantic on a sailing boat and cycled from southern Patagonia to northern Alaska. Then I crossed the Pacific Ocean and cycled from northern Siberia across Asia via Japan and China and Central Asia back to Europe and home. So I made it through 5 continents. Didn't in the end make it to where I set off for, Australia, but it was 4 years and 73,000 kilometres of cycling.
If a friend came to you and said, I think I'm going to cycle around the world too, what would you tell them?
I'd say, great, go for it. It is far physically easier than you think it is, and it is probably far mentally harder than you think it might be. But also, it is better than any education you'll ever get. So get on your bike and go for it, I would say.
That sounds like good advice. I'm not convinced yet, but
okay.
I was chatting to a guy the other day, a guy called Brett in Australia, in Melbourne, I think, who runs a business called Social Cycles, and he takes people on bike trips. And I was expecting to talk to him and find out, these people do a bit of training before they go. They're all fit and, it's all amazing. And then he shocked me by saying that the vast majority of his, or that kind of the average age of his tour customers is around 70. And they might not be real cyclists and they just hop on. And, like you say, it's not as physically demanding to cycle. It depends on the track and depends on the place, but it's not as physically demanding as I think it is when you say you're going on cycling hundreds of kilometres somewhere. It's perhaps not as bad as I expect. So maybe I'll give it a go.
Well, I didn't do any training at all. So, of course, at first I was really unfit and my bum hurt and I was really tired. But I wasn't racing, so I'd just cycle till I got tired and then I'd have a rest and put up my tent and then go again the next day. And gradually you do get fit. Anyone becomes fit if you try and cycle that far. So what is it that's still putting you off? What haven't I sold you on?
It's a good question. No, you know what? I am nearly sold, so I just need the time now. So, yeah, that's a function of lifestyle. I need my son to grow up a bit older and he can come with me, and then we'll be off. So we might cycle up your way some months soon.
Fantastic. That'd be lovely.
Yeah, no, I love the idea. We were in Denmark for a few weeks a couple of months ago now, and we, instead of using any public transport, we just hired bikes, and it was here in Australia, cycling is not usually very fun because the roads are horrifying for cyclists. It's quite dangerous. You get hit all the time. It just is not enticing to cycle places. Whereas in Copenhagen, everything's set up for the cyclist. I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. If I lived here, I would literally cycle everywhere. So it did inspire me.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, I think the future will be for cyclists, and places like Copenhagen and the Netherlands, of course. Mm-hmm. Even poor old London's making massive improvements on cycling. So I think there's a bit of a turn towards realizing that it's good for the environment, good for the physical and mental health, and also I believe is the best way to travel and go on an adventure. I've never found a better way of exploring a place than by strapping a tent onto the back of a bike and pedaling away from home.
That's awesome. Why do you think that is? Like, I feel like the speed is a good speed. It's a good compromise between walking is kind of slow and driving is too fast. But what else about cycling is the key?
Yeah, that's exactly one of them. The other is it's painful, because I like a bit of pain and suffering in my adventures. But it's not too painful. Like, walking is agony, so it's not too painful. It can get you off the beaten track to unusual, interesting places, and you realise what's often the lesson of adventure, that the best memories are not the so-called highlights. It's not the Lonely Planet guidebook tick sheet. It's the strange, quirky little things and villages and people and stuff that happens on the places in between. And cycling is very much about the places in between rather than the so-called destinations. And you're free. You can camp where you want. You can put up your tent when you want. You can go swim in that nice river. You can load up with fresh fruit and bread. It gives you the real freedom of travel that's important as well.
So 4 years, 5 continents, 73,000 kilometres of cycling. Not bad, hey? I don't think I will ever achieve that. I'm not sure I want to spend 4 years of my life cycling around the world, but I definitely want to do a bit more. Now, in that chat with Alastair, I did actually mention our next guest, which is Brett Seychell. He's the one who mentioned how people who come on his cycling tours are often around 70, which gives me plenty of hope because I have a couple of decades before then, a bit more than a couple even. Now I'm starting to sound older than I am. Anyway, I chatted with Brett at length about his sort of accidental discovery of just how good cycling across the world could be.
So my background is hospitality, and I've worked for sort of, private sector, corporate sector, all that sort of thing in hospitality and, big sort of multinational companies and whatever. And I think my moment, or I suppose my epiphany, where I just went on a completely different course was I used to work in London. I was working for like late night bars and restaurants. The music got a little bit too loud, and I think that's sort of a clear sign that you're getting a little bit too old. I was probably in my mid-30s, and I thought I want to do something a little different. So I need a holiday, and I didn't want one of those holidays where you go sit on a beach for 2 weeks. I didn't really want to come home to Australia where you're sort of like, you're scheduling in time with all your friends and family, and it's really sort of quite stressful. Yeah. So I thought I'll do something a little different. So I decided to see if I could ride a bike from London to Paris, which is, I suppose, far is subjective, but is, well beyond me. And hadn't ridden a bike since, I was a kid and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I wasn't really a cyclist or anything. So I bought a bike on Thursday, left on Sunday, had like no idea, didn't bring a pump or any tools, or like just completely packed full of ignorance. But fell on paper maps a whole lot, and fell on my feet, and so to speak, and and loved it. And I got back and I felt really refreshed and sort of quite alive. So and it made me feel really good back at work and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, it was only like another 12 months and I was kind of like down again and stressed and, you know, just, I suppose, on the daily grind as such. And then, so I thought I need to do something like this again. And Australia was playing Germany in South Africa in the World Cup in 2010. So I thought, well, maybe it's a good idea that I go to Germany from London and watch it in a pub or something like that.
Cool.
As we do. So I thought, and the best way to do that is I'll cycle there. So because I was feeling quite good about it and whatever. So again, sort of, just went by myself and cycled. And, you can cycle out of the UK in a day and then you cross France, just obviously the northern tip of France to get to sort of Belgium and Holland and then into Germany. And the whole thing took me about sort of 6 days. And I felt like I was crossing a country every single day. And, being from Australia, where our borders are so far, I know, right? So I was kind of feeling like, 10 foot tall and bulletproof. And I was just like, I can achieve anything. And I had my passport with me and a friend of mine came out to meet me, to have a beer and to sort of celebrate and all that. And I said, I've just never felt so like I've accomplished so much and so easily in such a short amount of time. And, if I wasn't sort of a semi-responsible adult with, a rented apartment and a job and all that sort of thing, I would just love to sort of keep going and just to wonder how far you can go and like, how far can you go? Like, how far could you cycle, if you had the time and whatever. So, and that was it. And that was the moment that sort of changed everything. And I thought, one day I'm going to do this and I'm going to cycle from London to Melbourne. And, it was a couple of beers into that conversation, but that was it. That moment, and nothing changed from there. So 12 months later to the day, I packed a bike, we put 4 bags on it, and I set off and I cycled from London to Melbourne.
Wow.
It took me 2.5 years. I crossed 26 countries and about 28,000 kilometres in the saddle. And that 2.5 years completely changed my life. And there's, there's a million stories within that 2.5 years as well, but that's the fundamental sort of impact that it really had, and it set me off on a completely different journey now, away from hospitality, which is great. But yeah.
But different. Wow. I mean, I knew you had, I know about your social cycle, so I knew, you're something of a cyclist, but I had assumed that you'd always had an interest in cycling, but it's astonishing to me to think you really had not ridden a bike and then suddenly, I'll just ride to Paris. Oh, why not Germany? Oh, why not all the way to Australia? I mean, that's really incredible. There must have been some moments where you thought that was a really stupid idea before and during, surely?
Oh, I don't know. Not really. It was awesome. Yeah, look, there was never a rush. There was no time limit. There was nothing. I mean, I ended up doing it with a friend of mine, and so it was just the two of us, and I think that worked quite well. Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I mean, if you didn't want to cycle that day, you just didn't. So sometimes, it sounds funny, but would almost take a holiday within this journey and just stop somewhere for a week or even 2 weeks and just, find a beach and then just do nothing because, it sounds ridiculous, but like it sounds super spoiled, but finding somewhere new to eat for breakfast, lunch and dinner and finding out where you're going to stay that night, it gets quite tiring. So sometimes it's just nice to sort of have a break. But I suppose the bicycle was the vehicle, so to speak. It was just a platform from getting from A to B. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, people are really open to bicycles. Like if you arrive by bus or if you arrive by car or back of the motorbike or whatever, you don't get the same reception as if you're sort of cycling through a town. And people are really, really friendly. So it opened up a whole new world as to travel. And I think people are more relatable to bikes, or they're interested. It's like what doing, you crazy man,
exactly.
cycling through this desert or whatever. Like you have a story. I want to know your story. What are you doing here, and what other countries have you been to, and what do you think of our country? And and it just really opens up that gateway to conversation to local people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's right. I spoke with someone not that long ago who's cycling from the top of North America down to the south, and he was saying, for example, in Mexico, it was incredible how he was still in Mexico, but how welcoming people were, and that they had these huge WhatsApp groups of Mexicans who were, fans of cyclists or also cycled themselves, and you would just kind of join this WhatsApp group and find somewhere to stay for the night, which was just someone's house, and they would greet you with fresh clothes so you could shower and change everything, and get rid of all your cycling sweats. And I mean, it was just, really interesting to see. I guess if you arrive on a bike, you must be, you're moving slowly, you're definitely kind of non-threatening, and you're bound to have an interesting story behind you because you've committed to do something, pretty big deal.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. And so there was a slightly different spin on it as well. So when I sort of started planning this, a lot of people were saying to me, like, are you doing it for charity? And I was like, not really, no, just kind of doing it for my own sort of sense of adventure and whatnot. And I was like, that's still okay, And I almost, massive sense of judgment, but I almost started feeling guilty. I was like, well, you know what? Look, if someone wants to give me £100 or whatever to pass it on to a charity, it's no skin off my nose. I'm doing it anyway, whatever. So then I started sort of thinking about, well, if I'm going to do this for charity, then what charity do you choose? And that sort of makes things a little bit interesting. So I thought it would make sense to find a charity that has projects in these various countries. So there's sort of some sense of connection to it. So I spoke to some of the bigger international kind of charities and asked them sort of, a little bit what they do and how it works and this, that, and the other. And I just kind of felt that the transparency wasn't quite there, and I wasn't allowed to sort of. I can kind of understand not visiting projects and beneficiaries, but I kind of would have liked to speak to a local representative of the organisation in that country, just to learn a little bit more about their projects and where their money would be going and whatever. And I felt that a lot of those doors were sort of closed, or they just didn't know, or it was a little bit too big, I think. So. I ended up starting my own charity. I called it The Kindness of Strangers. I ran some events, and I raised about £12,500. So when I left UK, I had this sort of money to sort of give away, and this really romantic, quite foolish and ignorant idea that the problems that I would find that I would be able to solve with this money would sort of fall in front of me. I'd get helped by a family who might have a sick child or something, and I could help with their medical benefits or something like that. It was really massively ignorant and really, like naive, but
very romantic and noble.
Yeah, noble. It was, but not at all practical. It would just work. Fate will show the way, kind of thing. And so what it did, though, I soon realised that wasn't going to happen. So it forced me to connect with some really local NGOs, and I could just sort of write to them and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm just traveling, basically. I didn't really sort of say I've got money to give away. I would just say I'm traveling through, and I'm interested in sort of social impact and community development, and can I meet with you and maybe buy you a coffee and just learn about your organisation and learn a bit more, and maybe I can sort of help promote you through my travels and my stories and website and whatever. So that was kind of the hook for them. But I also, again, obviously had money in my pocket to donate to things that I thought were sustainable and income generating and whatnot. So that really changed a lot for me. And when you go into a country, I think it's great to sort of experience the food, experience people and museums and monuments, and you can learn about history and all that sort of stuff. But when you meet people working in the community development sector, you're learning about what's happening, not just today, but also for tomorrow. And you're learning about social problems that you didn't even know existed because they're relevant in that culture. But unless you ask the right questions to the right people, you don't really scratch that surface. And it just blew my mind as to what sort of problems some of these amazing, inspirational people were tackling and how they were doing it. And, you just leave that country just completely sort of, in a different headspace with a different understanding, and knowing that you can sort of support some really small projects and seeing and understanding exactly how it works and how they've got there and what mistakes they've made in the past and what they're trying to avoid in the future and whatnot. Really, it did. I mean, I suppose that was the life-changing moment. That really sort of changed everything for me.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's it's so important that there's people who like you who are able to do that. I mean, I feel the same way, that it's very hard to know if you're donating to a charity. It's very hard to know where your money goes. And I've done some trips where I've been able to be in a community where that tour company has been helping, and they've been working with that, with empowerment projects and stuff. And you can see exactly where the money's gone and what they're planning for the future and how they're trying to make it sustainable and all of that. And that compared to just, donating to one of the big charities, sponsor a child or something. And, who knows that the percentage of your money that really gets there is probably not that great. And I mean, just to be able to have that knowledge that what's going on and where that money's going, that's a really powerful thing. Can you give us a couple of examples of the kinds of NGOs that you worked with or still work with, and what you came across and where the money was going?
Yeah, sure. So, so I did end up doing 13 projects or separate sort of investments or whatever it is on that 2.5-year ride underneath the banner of the Kindness for Strangers as such. And so the very first one, I think, was probably the defining, what are our values, and who do we give money to, and why should we, should you just give money to someone because they're poor and they want it? Is it a handout? Is it a hand up? If there's no follow up, is it worth, so it really sort of challenged so many ideas. So we ended up giving, so the very, very first one, it was only like a few $100 because I don't know, we had no idea how much it would last and what influence we could make. And in hindsight, I probably would have given her more, but there was a small community run NGO in Kosovo. We wanted to, I was sort of, the idea popped into my head about sort of the gypsy community and, what's their story, where do they live, how does that community sort of function? And because I suppose on a, the perspective from London, you probably don't get the whole picture. So it was like, well, how does that work? So in Kosovo, from one person who connected to another person, we found ourselves at a small NGO. We met this amazing young woman. She was like 22 years old, and she had saved, I think, about 200 or 300 euros, and she'd bought all these materials, and she'd organised. Well, it was part of the youth program, but it was basically, I suppose, a mother's club where these women would come in every weekend and they would, meet, but they would sort of make these handicrafts. But while they were doing that, then they would also take the opportunity to talk about health initiatives, to talk about raising their children. And so, as I say, it was sort of like it was a support network for each other and an educational opportunity as well. So they almost put a program in it. And what happened is they used all the materials that she'd bought, made some, bits and pieces, and because there was nothing to make, that the mothers stopped coming. Yeah. So we kind of said, well, we'll give you, I think, whatever, £300 or euros or whatever it was, we'll give you this, but we'd like you to explore the idea of potentially selling it at a market or having a store.
Yeah, exactly, making it sustainable.
And the money you make from the market, you put back into buying the materials, and you keep your program going, and whatnot. So that was the idea. We'd sort of adopt someone from the NGO to kind of look after it because it wasn't our role or space or place, and not our culture, or whatever. But that was sort of, we'd give it with that intention. If it never happened, it was never going to happen. We weren't in a position to sort of follow up because we were traveling. But we weren't the project managers. So it was really about knowing our place as well. So we just put it forward as an idea. They would take it and use it, and we'd sort of try and stay in touch. So that was one. Other ones, we bought for some small families. We bought some chickens and a rooster and a chicken coop for a couple of families in Sri Lanka.
Cool. Yeah.
We lucky enough to go to a women's refuge/resource centre in Tehran and speak to some people who work with disadvantaged and vulnerable women who may have been victims of abuse or looking for who definitely need sort of support from psychologists and social workers. So that was really interesting to sort of see how that works within that culture, and we supported them to about $1,000 or something like that. There was a few we put.
I love the varied nature of them. So, kind of exploring all different kinds of people and different kinds of helping, which I think is really interesting. So have Alastair and Brett convinced you that maybe a cycling trip might be something for you after all? You don't have to spend years doing it like they did, but maybe a short one. I mean, I have to say, as I mentioned, that my short stint of cycling in Denmark earlier this year has really made me think that getting around on a bike is such a cool thing to do. And I think, as Brett mentioned, people, really chat to people on bikes. It's a bit special. So I'm quite sure that more cycling is in my future. It might be in yours as well. I would love to hear what you think. And if you have indeed also done any big or small cycling trips in the past, hop over to our Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers. There's a link in the show notes, or you can just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook and find us there. Let us know about what you have done on a bike around the world. Or if you think that it's the worst idea in the world and your bottom will just be too sore, you can say that too. Anyway, a very big thank you to both my guests today. First up, of course, was Alastair Humphreys, and you can find him at alastairhumphreys.com. And next, I chatted with Brett from Social Cycles, and you can find him at social-cycles.com. Now, don't forget my quest for 250,000 downloads by the end of 2019. Please tell a friend or do something to help me out. I'll be very, very, very grateful. Thank you very much. For any of the info from today, and I think I'll even manage to find a picture of me on a bike to put in the show notes. You can find the show notes for this episode at notaballerina.com/161. Happy cycling, or happy travelling at the very least. And as always, thank you very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.